Welcome to our podcast, Geeks, We Are Your Fathers. We're three proud geek dads and we're here to talk all things technology, gaming, science fiction and more. This week, we're talking Raspberry Pi. Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Geeks, We Are Your Fathers. I'm Robbie.
I'm Pete.
And I'm Dave.
So in this episode, we're going to be taking a closer look at Raspberry Pis.
Not ones you can eat. But you probably guessed that seeing as a tech podcast.
Oh dear. So Pete, I think you were heavily into Raspberry Pi when it first got launched.
Yeah, so it's funny actually because a friend of mine, her son, Ben, he was, I think 10 at the time, Ben 10. And he said, have you seen this really cool Raspberry Pi computer thing? And I'm like, no, what's that then? And it had been all over the BBC. And I think actually the games designer, the guy who did Elite, is it David Braben, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I played tons of it.
Exactly. So he was actually, I think, on the original foundation as well. There's a few of them. There was Eben Upton, David Braben, a guy called Pete, whose surname escapes me, who did one of the board layouts, and Pete Norcott, I think it was, and there's a few other guys, but they're a relatively small outfit, sort of based out of Cambridge University, and there's a few other chaps with them as well. And I'd never heard of this thing, right? It's basically, it was a single board computer. I knew about Arduinos and things at the time, where you could sort of tinker and do maker projects and stuff. But this was kind of a revolutionary sort of thing. It was a $35 computer, basically. They were sort of coining it as. So, and at the time, it was pretty revolutionary. I mean, it had a 32-bit micro on board. It was running a Linux operating system, so it was basically a desktop. So you plug this thing into your monitor and add a keyboard and a mouse. And it had an Ethernet connection on it, so you could connect it up to the web, and you could basically use it like a desktop. So I don't know whether you guys have ever loaded like Ubuntu onto an old laptop. You ever done that? Yeah. So
I haven't.
So David, you're not geeky enough, obviously. Yeah.
Analog geek. I'm an analog geek. So
the first thing you tend to do when your laptop is old and knackered is that the easiest thing to do is just take Windows off and put Ubuntu, which is the open source operating system for Linux. So basically what these guys have done is they built this little single board computer. It's like the size of a credit card, and they basically built a Linux computer which you could plug in and just use and surf the web and code on. And the whole thing was around coding, right? It was about how can we get kids into coding at a low price. And there'd been things around for a while where Bill Gates talking about the $100 computer at the time, so that any kid can go and go to school, and because of digital poverty and stuff. And this thing comes along at $35. Now it hasn't got a screen obviously, or a keyboard or a mouse or anything, but those things are relatively accessible. And the power supply was just basically like an Android charger, so a micro USB, so they were easy to get hold of. And at the time, I think most people, even back in 2012 when this thing came out, had maybe an HDMI TV, or if you didn't, you had an old monitor, you could just get an adapter for it. But they were pretty revolutionary in the fact that they were designed to help kids to learn how to code. And when this thing went live on BBC News, and the tech journalist Rory Kathleen Jones, I think, was sort of championing it, and he made friends with Eben, one of the founders, who basically was he did work for Broadcom at the time as a Broadcom processor on it, an ARM processor. And this thing all of a sudden created this massive hype, and everyone was talking about it, and everyone was following the story. It was pretty, I guess, localized at that time, I guess, to the UK, and so I decided to write a blog about it. So I just wrote a blog about this amazing cool new thing called Raspberry Pi, and about how it could teach the kids around the world to code, and the fact that it was so low cost that it was really accessible to everybody. And I wrote this blog, and we published it on DesignSpark, and we put it out on social media. And the next thing I know, we've got Eben Upton emailing me saying, "Hey, we want to come talk to you guys about maybe RS building and distributing this thing." And the rest is history, right? And I guess we've been doing that now for the last 8 years, building it for them under license down at the Sony Penco factory in Wales. And we have over the years built them in China as well at facilities. So that's kind of sort of how it all came about, really. And then there was this massive explosion, and it kind of took, the maker industry, right, which we've spoken about before. So that kind of exploded the maker industry from going from the underground, if you like, which is, there was a lot of these sort of hack spaces and maker spaces, and they were sort of frequented by very sort of geeky people. But when the Raspberry Pi came along, it kind of made it really accessible, because they built this massive community almost overnight. And they couldn't build enough of them. I think they only had on the first one 7,000 boards, and they could have sold those literally 1,000 times over. They had so much interest, it was unbelievable.
I remember them selling out really quickly, because I remember people coming to me saying, "Can you get me hold of one?" As if it's something like some sort of big Apple launch. But it's.
And Pete, you had one of the very first ones, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I mean, funny enough, I've actually got a panel. So I don't even know anything about PCBs, but when they make PCBs, they basically come out on a panel. You got 12 to a panel, or whatever. So I've actually got one of the panels, the original panels, in a frame, which you could need by Pete Norcott, and that was really cool. So that was one of the only things before they even manufactured them. I was sort of showing that to customers, and we were going to trade shows and stuff and showing that. And then I managed to get my hands on one of the prototype runs. I think I've still got it here somewhere, actually, in one of my drawers. The Model B, which was the first one that came out, and I actually took that home, and Eben gave it to me and says, so you just use these Linux commands, blah blah blah. I'm like, oh, Linux, I haven't done any Linux programming really for a long time, and I kind of had a bit of an idea, so I thought no problem. I mean, it's just basic Linux commands and stuff. Did a bit of programming when I was a kid and stuff, but mainly basic when I was young. And I basically took it home and I plugged it all into the computer, and I'm like, I get in there, right, and you the little command prompt up, and it reminds you of the days of DOS. I don't know if you guys have done any DOS programming back in the day in the 80s.
I have, a long time ago, but yeah.
Yeah, so you got your little DOS prompts, almost, if you like. So you got your little prompt, and you type in, basically, the password was type in Raspberry and then Pi as the password, and then it would fire at the desktop. Right, so you literally fire at the desktop, and you'd be presented with this desktop, which is, and still is actually based on a Debian release, right, which is basically a flavour of Linux, right? So Debian, funny enough, comes, I think, from the name of the guy who invented that version, and his name was Ian, and his wife was called Debbie, right? So I think they called it Debian. So they did. So basically, it had a Debian desktop, and it was really, really cool, right? Because I say you could get it up, you could surf the web. They had a code window. They had the Scratch programming on there. Your kids have probably done Scratch, right?
Yeah.
Pretty simple language.
Yeah, I think so.
And but what was really unique about this thing is that it had these what we call GPIO pins. So not only could you get this thing linked up to your computer and then start programming to it. Now it's Python, right? Mm-hmm. Raspberry Pi is a Python-based code, and you can write other code to it. But ultimately, it's built around Python, and you use a Python editor and stuff. Funny enough, that's another story why it's called Raspberry Pi, right? So Raspberry, I guess you can probably guess why it's called Raspberry, piece of tech, right? BlackBerry, Apple, all that kind of stuff. And the Pi actually stands for Python, right? So the Pi bit actually stands for the Python, so it's Raspberry Pi, and that's why it's called Raspberry Pi. So they were playing on the kind of whole tech scene around the fruit-based stuff, and then the Pi was the bit that's sort of similar, which was all around the Python bit of it. So yeah, and what was really cool about this thing is that they had these GPIO pins. So the GPIO pins, if you look at a Raspberry Pi, it looks like obviously like a single board computer, like a PCB with loads of components on, and then you've got all these little pins that poke up, and they're what you call the GPIO. And what that's really cool is that you can then do physical hardware projects with that. So not only are you coding to the thing, but you buy the GPIO, you can connect cables in if you like, and connect.
So when you can put the hats on top of it and
yeah, so they developed eventually the hat protocol, which allowed you to put on so you drop basically your daughter board or your hat onto the top of the Raspberry Pi via the GPIO pins, and that would be your little applications. It could be a motor control board or LEDs or whatever. But yeah, those GPIO pins basically gave you the physical computing world. So you could then take your code that you were doing and not just run the code, but you could actually run code to control things, right? Which is amazing. So makers all of a sudden pick this up. So not only was it targeted at schools, but that it kind of, the maker industry embraced this product, because products like the Arduino, which are amazing, don't run an operating system. Okay, so these things do, right? So this thing is an operating system.
It's a self-contained thing.
It's a self-contained computer, basically. It's like a laptop, if you like, without the casing on it, I guess in layman's terms. And this allows you, again, say, to do the hardware projects. And out of that sprang things like Raspberry Jams. Did you ever go to one of my Raspberry Jams, Dave, when we had them at Oxford?
I did, yeah, because you did them in Oxford.
That's right.
In the Oxford office. Oh, yeah.
So we ran these Raspberry Jams. So Raspberry Jam basically was a bunch of Raspberry Pi enthusiasts who got together around the country. And there was a guy called, I think it was Techno Teacher, who's still on the Raspberry Pi scene. And he started off this Raspberry Jam, and it eventually became an official a Raspberry Pi kind of meetup, if you like. And basically, people would set up their own jam. I think we did ours at Oxford when a guy who was local to us, he said, look, I'm running this Raspberry Jam in my flat, and there's like 3 of us that go to it. Have you got anywhere? He contacted me through DesignSpark and said, is there anywhere you could maybe help us get a space where we could do something bigger? And we said, yeah, let's come and do it at our offices when we were at Oxford at the time. And so that's what happened. We ended up with about 30 or 40 people, actually,
Wow.
at these meetups. Everyone bringing their project. It's like a BYO project. So, every week you say, right, show us what projects you've got. And people would come up and they give like a 5-minute quick talk or maybe longer. And then everyone would share and discuss what was going on and share ideas and help each other out. It was brilliant. And lots of these guys were part of the Hackspace movement as well. So there were some guys from the Oxford Hackspace at the time, because that was just down in the city near to us. And we had people travelling actually quite a long way to come to us, to come to our meetups on a Wednesday night, I think it was. We did it like once a month, and it was great. And then we obviously moved from Oxford, and we kind of had to close it down. But so that really again kick-started that kind of whole revolution around the maker industry adopting this, schools getting it. And then it started getting adopted by industry as well.
Hey, that's kind of it's strange how it's been. The intention of it was very much towards that education, and now you see them everywhere. I mean, I remember seeing. I went out to Italy once with somebody from RS at the time who they'd worked with to actually implement Raspberry Pis into the San Siro Stadium where AC Milan and Inter Milan play. And ultimately, the Raspberry Pis were responsible for, if one team was playing, it would switch all of the lighting to blue. And then the other team was playing, it would switch all of the lighting and the screens and the imagery to the other one. And it was all controlled by, as you say, a Raspberry Pi, a very cheap and affordable piece of technology could do something so big and for companies and for organizations that are huge. And then it's obviously gone on from that to really be used in industry as well.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, people pick them up for factory control systems, and they built solutions around it. And I mean, this is also great. They're such a versatile product, because they connect to the internet. I mean, the newer ones have got Wi-Fi. I think even a 5G radio on one of the new ones. But you've got Ethernet. You can dial into these things remotely. They can be headless, so you don't have to have a screen or a keyboard or a mouse if you like. You can what you call SSH into them, for example, where you can actually set up a terminal on your laptop, and then over the web you can basically interact with them and have a screen up on your laptop. So, which
is ultimately what happened recently with the RadioGlobe project.
Yes, which we'll come on to in a minute, which is an awesome project. So, and that's the thing, right? This whole thing started, this whole maker revolution, and everybody was creating projects and sharing projects, and then you got like companies like kind of Adafruit, who you probably heard of, who were, I think, in business at the time, but all of a sudden companies like that rocketed in their sales and their activities because Raspberry Pi kind of was this massive interest everywhere. But it took some time actually to get some traction around the world. It was really big in the UK for a while, and then in Japan, big in Japan. Isn't that an 80s band? Anyway, so
it was a song. It was a song.
It was a song.
Yeah.
Who was that by? I don't know.
I think it was Japan.
There you
go. Somebody's going to put in the comments and tell me I'm totally wrong. But for some reason, my 80s knowledge has failed me.
No way. So anyway, they were big in parts of the world, and then the US was a bit more of a slow adoption. I think. I mean, now it's a lot bigger than it was, and they've got some great adoption. But I think products like the BeagleBone, which I don't know whether you've heard of the BeagleBone, which is it's a TI based product, and it's very similar to the Raspberry Pi, but it's like 2 or 3 times the price, for example. Fantastic product, right? But I guess the Raspberry Pi sort of came in at that lower price point and has got that community behind it, and I think that's really driven it. I mean, it's not always the best board for the job. They're amazing boards, but the fact that they've got this huge global community with all the projects, open source code, open source hardware that goes alongside it. So
and the expertise to help you. I think you're right. I mean, that's similar to. I mean, Arduino is very similar in Italy, and that's why it was quite difficult for Raspberry Pi to break that market at one point because Arduino people who used Arduino were very passionate about it, and likewise they had that huge community there, and Raspberry Pi has the same. So as you say, it's not always technically the right thing to use or the best thing to use, but it has all of the other things going for it with the support and everybody else able to help with developing things.
The availability and the accessibility is a big thing. I remember going to the Hanover Messe which is the big industrial show which happens at the end of April every year. Didn't last year for obvious reasons. And I, apart from anything else, I was blown away by the size of this show, having been used to going to electronic shows for however many, 25 years, 30 years, or whatever it was, and going to NEPCON back in the day, and then EDS, and then Electronica in Munich, and thinking they're big. And then you end up at Hanover to go to the Messe, where there's 25 different halls. Yeah. But there were people there, I mean, big names, people like Siemens, who were including Raspberry Pi modules as part of their automation and process control equipment.
Yeah.
And this was back, I went with Chris Liddell, so this must have been 2016 I went, and I've got no reason to think that it's gone down. And funnily enough, the one part of we joke about the fact I'm an analog geek, and I kind of am. In terms of the connectors world, this hasn't really impacted me that much, but there's a lot of connector people at the moment talking about the Internet of Things, and especially the industrial Internet of Things, smart factories, and edge computing is a big part of that.
Huge.
And Raspberry Pi has got applications in edge computing, bringing the technology, bringing the intelligence to the factory floor.
Yeah.
And it's an easy way of doing that, isn't it? You put this tiny little board in a tiny little box, and you plug it in, and then you've got processing power right at the point where you need it.
Yeah, it's interesting because actually Raspberry Pi saw that, and there's quite a few versions of the Raspberry Pi out now, right? And they started with the B, then they went to the A, then they did a compute module which was kind of designed at you embedding that into maybe an industrial application. So it was just like a gumstick size thing, and you know, and so
Pico.
And now you've got the Pico, which is what, £5 or something. It's just ridiculous. In fact, I've ordered one. I'm still waiting on it. Just reminding me, but I chased it up. So you know, and then they had the Zero, which was, I think I got my first Zero when it came out on the Magpie magazine. You know, they gave it free, gave it away free, you know, like on a computer magazine. And and it's just incredible how it's going from there. But I just want to touch back on things. So when I said about open source, so just to be clear, the Raspberry Pi isn't open source hardware, right? So the Raspberry Pi itself is, people say, oh, it's open source. Well, actually, what's open source is the software element. So I guess that's where many people get confused. Okay. So you can't go and get the Raspberry Pi design files and build your own Raspberry Pi. I mean, people would try and reverse engineer it, but ultimately, it's not open source hardware. But what is open source is, in effect, you know, the Linux operating system it sits on, because people can take, you know, a vanilla flavor of it and they can develop their own on top. Obviously, because then you can build your own applications and build your own versions of the desktop, etc., and whatever you will run it for, or you know, or you can share open source code, and most people are sharing, you know, the code, and they share that through various means, either GitHub or any, you know, forum who's got a repository where you might want to share code, or DesignSpark even, or Instructables, or all these sort of places. So it is really cool. And so when I first got one in my hands, as I say, we were talking earlier, and I brought it home, and I got me, you know, I sort of knelt down, put, you know, knees on the carpet, got my keyboard out, you know, remember those days, you know, when you used to go down to the WH Smiths, you know, here in the UK, and the newsagents, and you would get yourself your computer magazine every week, and I'd get my Commodore 64 out, and I'd stop, you know, typing in all the code, you know, and get syntax errors everywhere because you'd made a tiny little mistake. And
you can never find them.
And you can never find them, you know. And then, so I was very rusty. My mate came around actually when I got it, and he did a bit of Unix programming when he was an apprentice. So he helped me sort of, you know, do a few things and commands to sort of get it running and stuff. And it was amazing, you know. And it's developed so much from there. But yeah, that for me just brought back so many memories of when I was a kid and running into Dixon's and type in, you know, basic, you know, 10. Print Pete is cool, 20 go to 10, and it would scroll up and down the screen. Did you ever do that, Dave?
Yeah.
Robbie's going, what's that all about?
No, I remember.
So yeah, you used to get all the computers lined up in Dixon's in the electronics store, and then you basically, because they couldn't lock them like they used to, like they can these days, and yeah, you would just go to the command prompt and type that and run away, and you'd have all the screens displaying your name. We used to see that, so just reminding me of that really. And but yeah, and then say the Raspberry Pi is incredible over the last 2012, I think it launched, and you know, they've done a new version probably pretty much every year, sometimes I think maybe two, and it's just taken the world by storm, and it's everywhere. As you're saying, it's in industry, it's in makers, it's in schools,
I like trying to find them in the wild when you're out in shops
Yeah.
and things now, and you can just you see a screen and you think that is a
Flashing
pie.
away.
That is 100% a pie showing me that information, and more often than not it is. I mean, I work a lot with design agencies and things as well,
Yeah.
and the amount of agencies that just have a little room full of Raspberry Pis just because they know they'll use them, and they know
Yeah.
that it's a very easy solution, and it doesn't take somebody with huge amounts of experience in coding. It just takes people who know what they're doing with certain platforms and and to get them working for certain applications. But yeah, there's always some of them out there in the wild, especially when you're in clothes shops and things. Recently, I noticed those.
Yeah, they are, and that's the thing, they use digital signage, but you're right. I guess the good thing about pies as well is that coders who are coding guys who've never really touched hardware, and we've seen this in the industrial, the Internet of Things kind of area. So you've got coders who are doing IoT type applications. They've got no experience with hardware, but it's really easy for them to pick up a Raspberry Pi, do their coding to it, because it's all Linux based. You can do C++ and all that to it if you want, and then you can just deploy that out in the field, connect it to the web, and you can add sensor boards on top and all this kind of stuff. You can very quickly do an IoT application with no hardware experience at all. And that's accelerated a lot of people and a lot of startups, So I think we've mentioned before, the startups that have come out of this. So the one that's sort of close to my heart is the PyTop guys who basically took this idea. The great thing about the Raspberry Pi is it's cheap. The hard thing to do when you're going into a classroom with it, and I did it in the early days, and I managed to get myself on the BBC TV. Hello, Bob.
Kind
of thing, right? But I went into with a friend of mine, Sue Black. And she took me into her local school. It was down in what's the name? Where's The Good Life filmed? Surbiton. That was it. Yeah. Right. And we went and we did coding in a school with kids there. And the really hard bit was trying to round up monitors, keyboards, screens and all, and mice and all that kind of stuff. And we managed to do it in the end. We got a bit of a collection together. What the PyTop guys did is they basically put this Raspberry Pi into a low cost, almost it's a laptop style configuration. So they had a laptop keyboard. It was basically looked like a laptop, but under the hood was a Raspberry Pi plugged into it.
And wasn't it initially 3D printed as well? So you could actually you could buy the files. I remember that, and you could buy the files and print it yourself.
Yeah.
And then just add your Pi into it. But
I think it was 120 hours. I think Ryan and Jesse were telling me to print that first Pi. So I met these guys. Funny enough, because Ryan was actually at Oxford University, I believe, and they were on our doorstep at the time, and they came into our office and started telling us about this Pi thing, and they said, "Oh yeah, we've used DesignSpark PCB, and we've used your mechanical your mechanical design tool, DesignSpark Mechanical, to do one of the first editions of this." And yeah, they literally printed it. I had to stay up with it all night and take shifts because it took 120 hours to print.
3D printing is never as easy as they make out when you buy a printer, is it?
No.
Although you say that, my only real claim to fame with anything to do with Raspberry Pi was I actually created the first 3D model.
Oh yeah, you did.
The Type B Raspberry Pi for the RS website.
Yeah.
You should get that on a T-shirt,
at the
Dave.
time, I know. I was designing 3D models of Raspberry Pi before it was cool. And I remember actually designing it thinking, well, we're going to publish it, but who's going to want to use it?
Yeah.
And I don't think the guys actually did it. They never would have printed a Raspberry Pi because you got the real deal. But the fact is, you need
a space
a
model.
3D model sometimes.
Yeah.
It's a space model.
Yeah.
You need it to arrange the space around it. So I don't know how many times it got downloaded. I could probably still go and find out.
I'll go and find out for you, Dave.
So your model could have been responsible for PyTop. They could have used that.
Hey,
you played your part there, Dave.
Now that's a claim to fame. That's you'll probably find it's been downloaded 3 times, and twice of those are me checking it.
And to be honest, what you were saying there as well, Pete, what's great about the PyTop that I really like is that, as you mentioned earlier, Raspberry Pi bring out a new version every year. And the way that PyTop developed was that actually you can just retrofit every time a new version comes out. Yeah. You're basically upgrading your laptop with the latest version. And it just slots in, magnetic, really, really simple to use. And again, I've done sessions with children with that as well. And it's so easy to get to grips with and just get started and play.
Yeah, it's a great product. And so, that's the thing. It's kickstarted new businesses, so startups. It's inspired the maker industry. It's got kids into coding. They've got these things, like you say, in industry. They're everywhere because they're so low cost. Why would you design a board if you've got like 100 things to put together? You wouldn't design your own PCB. Just use a Raspberry Pi, stick it in a box, put some code on it, add a couple of maybe design or add on some additional hardware like via the GPIO pins, and off you go. And it's just incredible. And the projects, I know we'll come on to it a bit later on, but some of the projects that have come out of Raspberry Pi are just absolutely incredible, and some of the cool things that people have done. And they've even put one in space. They've even went up to the International Space Station, and they put one, and Tim Peake, I think, did a...
I remember Tim Peake talking about it.
And the paperwork they had to put together for that was the size of about 10 telephone directories, I think, just to make sure it wouldn't interfere with anything, right? But I remember Eben telling me. But what an incredible achievement to get a Raspberry Pi in space. And other people were putting, I think, these into... some of these little Pico satellites as well. There's a whole Pico satellite community who are doing like these sort of amateur satellites that you can stick into low Earth orbit, and you basically there's a whole group of people around the world doing this, and basically you go and find your local rocket launch place. I guess somewhere Ross, it'll be somewhere in Kazakhstan. It'll go up on some Soyuz rocket, I guess. Possibly wouldn't get there because it would blow up on the way, but they've been putting these things into sort of low Earth orbit for satellites and stuff as well. So there's such an amazing piece of kit, and I've got them everywhere. And I've been doing things. I've run Plex servers off them. I've done little projects. I've done a bit of coding with the kids, and I build little projects, and they're just amazing pieces of kit for the price. The fact that they've got this massive global community just makes it such a simple thing to get into.
And it's always good as well. I know from my own experience that you tend to buy the new ones when they come out, and you end up with the old ones. They're still useful. I try and pass mine on to somebody who is trying to get started, and just every time you get a new one, just make sure you don't end up with a drawer full of the old ones, because that's very easy to do as well. I learned that the hard way. I think I had about 7 or 8 that I'd used, and I'd kind of just discarded somewhere, and then I thought, actually, somebody can still get use out of these. So just anybody listening, if you've got Pi sitting around, go and give them to somebody who can actually use them and get them into coding as well.
So I just got a new one as well. So the Pi 400, which is, if you've not seen it, is cool. It's basically the concept sort of the Pi top, but it's no screen. So it's the Raspberry Pi stuck in a keyboard, and on the back you've got your connectors. So all you need, it's got a mouse going to it. All you need basically is a screen, and if you want to, you can stick a regular webcam on it. You need to run some code to do it, to pull that down. But you're thinking about digital poverty again, and kids working at home during the pandemic, and laptops are expensive. You could almost have a classroom out of a box for like 100 and something, just over £100.
I've seen organisations who've been doing that. They've been actually trying to get hold of at least sort of 50 to 100 of those. And again, when you're looking wider, and you touched on earlier the fact that they're produced in South Wales, they're not produced out in China. So,
some might be, so maybe a disclaimer, but I think a lot of them are done here in South Wales.
The fact that there's no shortage in terms of getting them in. You just need to look over at Sony and the PlayStation 5 and the semiconductor shortage to see how much of an effect there is at the moment on technology. So the fact that they're able to be produced affordably and locally means that you're able to also get them out, which is really good.
Absolutely.
You mentioned as well there, Pete, around the project, so that takes us on nicely to our next item, which is In Pursuit of Dispute, where we all agree to disagree about any given subject. So keeping in with the theme this time, what is your favourite ever Raspberry Pi project?
So I'll kick off, I guess, just and I'm going to be biased and choose one of the projects that I've done or been involved with, because there are literally probably millions of projects out there now, aren't there, that you can do, and there's been a lot of duplication, but... and Dave will remember this, and I think you do as well, Robbie. But back in 2014, was it? I just forget what the date is now. We had a call from Mattel Toys at the office, and they said, "Oh yeah, we want to. We're doing this Extreme Toys travel campaign, and it's Mattel Italy. This was doing it, and we want to send one of our Superman action figures into space. Can you do it?" We went, "Oh yeah, all right then, we'll do that for you, no problem." Right? No idea we were going to do it. And then got Googling, and a guy that I think we'd met at one of the Raspberry Jams, a guy called Dave Akerman, he's what they call a HAB enthusiast. So it's a high altitude ballooning guy. So basically what they do is they stick things on weather balloons, and they track them, and they go and chase them and see how far they can get. And in the summer, these things can go like a few miles, but in the winter, I think with the jet stream, I think you can actually get to as far as like Russia and sort of places like that, which is incredible. But anyway, so we met up with him, and then our old friend of ours as well, Jude Pullin, who in fact the first time I met Jude Pullin, he'd done a Raspberry Pi case on DesignSpark made out of cocktail sticks,
Cardboard. That's
cardboard.
Right,
He loves cardboard.
that's it. The cooling vent was a hole cut out of a corrugated piece of cardboard with cocktail sticks over it to make the vent.
That's right.
It was. I mean, it's a work of art. Jude is a genius.
And he actually used Tic Tac box and the little bits of plastic, and he used them as light tunnels. So he put them over the LEDs, and that would then he put them into the cardboard or the fascia, and they would light up. It was absolutely amazing. So I met Jude when he did that. So I knew he was a card modelling guru. At the time, he was working for Dyson modelling vacuum cleaners and stuff in cardboard, and I commissioned him basically to build us a capsule for Superman, and then I made friends with the Reading Hackspace via Alex. So Alex Gibson, again, one of the Jam guys, used to be with us at Oxford. He became a 3D printing guru as well, but he introduced me to the guys at the Reading Hackspace. So I met a load of guys there. So Richard and Ryan and Gary and all the guys that did the boat project with us, Sequest. So we basically they did all the PCB layout. So Richard did the PCB layout for us, and we got the 3D printing bits and stuff done with Alex, and then we also had Jude to come along and do the capsule. So we cut Superman open, we put stuff inside, and we made these little PCBs. And then to track it, we used a Raspberry Pi based tracker. So Dave Akerman had actually invented this thing called the Pi in the Sky, basically, and it was a little header board, a little hat, as you call it, isn't it, that sits on top of the Raspberry Pi, and it's basically a radio transmitter with a GPS position, right? And you would connect up to that, and then you get the position of it. So we had that as a tracker, and we also built our own using DesignSpark PCB as a backup, and then we used 3 Raspberry Pi cameras as well, plus some 4K cameras from Panasonic. So with the Raspberry Pi cameras, we're taking stills. So we basically had like 4 Raspberry Pis on board. One was an A with the tracker, and then we had 3 Bs, I think, with the camera modules and the SD cards taking stills as we went up and record everything. So yeah, we stuck that thing, and the whole thing weighed about 2.5 kilos. And we got all this together. It was massive, and then we filmed it all, and we basically sent it up to, in old money, 120,000 feet, I think it was. So it's about 22 miles, which I think is about 33 kilometres, depending on where you are in the world and what measurements you want. And this thing we filmed all the way up, and we tracked it, and we basically chased it in the chase cars. We had the Yagi aerials out because it was basically putting it works on 433 megahertz radio signal. It's coming back. So we were tracking it sort of basically on the one of the ham radio frequencies, and we chased it, and we ejected Superman as well. So basically we got to a certain height. The video is amazing. If you got to watch it, I think if you Google Superman space travel on YouTube, you'll get it.
Yeah,
and
that's the link that I.
That's the link, yeah. And it goes up, gets to 22 miles, and basically we eject out Superman. And then the capsule comes down, the balloon bursts automatically, the weather balloon, just in the atmosphere at about that height as well. So we chuck Superman out first, and then you've got 2 things to chase. They've both got trackers in, and we basically went and recovered both of them, and we collected all the data and the video, and it made a fantastic projects and stuff. So that was 4 Raspberry Pis, and some of our own electronics, and that was an incredible project that we did all those years ago, and so that's going to be my pick, I guess, for
and I can confirm it was 2014 because it was Electronica 2014
yes.
in Munich. We had the pod, the module, the thing that had actually gone up under the balloon was on our stand, the RS stand at Electronica.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that's right.
So we had Superman, this model, which was, I don't know, it was 50, 60 centimetres tall.
Yeah, it was a regular 12-inch model.
Yeah. And then the pod that he sat in was on the stand, and I was on the stand, and so was Pete. I was doing my own thing with 3D modelling one side of the stand, and Pete, the whole 4 days of the show, had 4 people, 4 layers of people, crowded round.
We had the video running in the background, didn't we, as well, showing it.
Yeah. I don't know how many times you would have told that tale during that week, because I remember on Friday when we were going home to get on the plane, you could hardly talk.
Yeah, I was hoarse with it. It did get so much interest, it was incredible, and we've got a load of press interest, and we all got on Italian TV, and we got thousands and thousands of views. It was brilliant. Yeah, we absolutely loved it. So yeah, that for me is one of the most proud moments of a Raspberry Pi based.
It does still live on as well, doesn't it, Pete? Because we even took it to Maker Fairs, I think as recently as
Rome,
2019. So we had it at the UK Maker Faire and we had it in Rome. And even then, I mean, there's something magical about, especially kids, because the Maker Fairs, that's where the big difference is compared to the sort of electronicas and the big trade fairs, is there's children there as well. And seeing their reaction when they're actually realising the pod that they're looking at has actually been to space was just mind-blowing. They couldn't quite believe it. But
well, we say space, but it's actually, it was the stratosphere.
Edge of space.
Yeah,
but exactly, I mean, as a child, that's still far
of course,
enough.
it's space. I mean, you saw the curvature of the Earth and everything, and it was dark and absolutely,
Flat Earthers didn't believe it.
No.
So you can hear my dog doing Chewbacca impressions in the background. I do.
It's okay. Mine's been doing that all day, and I'm just waiting for him to start reacting. But yeah, I mean, I'm very similar in that I'm going to do another project that was actually a DesignSpark project, and another project that was with Jude Pullen. It was quite a recent one. So the RadioGlobe project, which was last July, I think it was, that was launched. But ultimately, it was just a really great project to be a part of. It's an open source hardware and software project that began with the DesignSpark engineering community, but has actually ended up so much wider than that. And ultimately, they built a DIY kit that can be 3D printed and soldered yourself, and you can assemble it into being a physical globe that once you rotate the arm on that globe, which is 3D printed, you can listen to up to 2,000 different radio stations anywhere around the world.
Yeah.
And the beauty of it is it's screenless, so it can literally be operated by pretty much anyone. I mean, Jude's son's 4 years old, and he was having a great time with it and managed to work it. Then it's also been made by Chuck, who's a guy out in the US who found it on Instructables and decided to recreate it. And it's been really good to see how it's continued to live on. So as we say, it was sort of midway through the summer last year that it was first released on DesignSpark. But since then, it's kind of worked its way around every engineering community you can think of. It's been made by sort of a handful of people who have actually shared their finished product with us. And it's been so good in a time of sort of isolation because of the pandemic. You're still able to go and explore the wider world and through the medium of radio, but understand what's going on in the world of music, in the world of news, in the world of debate, if you can understand the languages. But it's just been really, really a fun project, and great to see how it's kind of taken on a mind of its own and piqued the interest of so many people. Yeah,
I've actually got it in my workshop at the minute, up the garden. It is an incredible piece of engineering that he's done, and it uses rotary encoders, so really high resolution rotary encoders from Bourne's to kind of step through. But it's great. I mean, I love the way you just sort of surf around and find channels, and it's just like amazing listening to radio stations. You know, I mean, I don't know about you, but whenever I go on holiday anywhere, I love listening to the local radio. Yeah. Because you kind of feel a bit more like you're on holiday. Don't
it's usually English music, though. That's the thing that always interests me is you tune into a radio station in the middle of South America and they're playing sort of 1980s and 1990s English pop, and that's part of the intrigue is the fact that how wide certain musicians get, and artists that you think nobody else will have ever heard of outside of their hometown in some circumstances, but they manage to get to the other side of the world playing on the radio. But yeah, it's incredible, and it's one of those projects as well. I mean, you mentioned earlier the power of community, and that's where the real value has been in that project, because it's not just about how it's been created, but because of the open source nature, it actually allows people to then take it on and develop certain aspects. So there's been talk of sort of creating a Shazam button, so that if you find a song on a radio station anywhere in the world, that you can automatically Shazam that, then potentially take that from there into your Spotify account or your Apple Music account. And because it's all been made open source, it means that people can start working on those things and ultimately make improvements that they think they can. Yeah.
No, it's a cool project.
My favourite project is, I mean, I've never really embraced Raspberry Pi in the same way that you guys have. Maybe it's because it's fear from my point of view. I'm not necessarily an electronics guy, and so I've always been a bit nervous about getting one. And I suppose I shouldn't, I'm not going to break the thing. No. Just need to plug it in and try it. But I've never really got on board with the idea of one of these projects. I've always been on the sidelines watching Pete do the Superman to space or or Sequest or whatever. But there was one that I found, and we've talked about music before on the podcast, and the fact that I like guitars. And if you talk to almost any guitarist, they'll have a whole bunch of effects pedals, these big metal stomp boxes that they put on the floor, and they do everything, whether it's distortion or fuzz or wah-wah or all the effects that people use to get incredible sounds out of guitars. I'm a bass player, so I use slightly fewer of them, but I do still have a handful of them. But there's these guys called Electrosmash, electrosmash.com. They seem to exist to find the wiring of old effects pedals that aren't in production anymore. Stuff that famous guitarists were using in the 60s and 70s to try and recreate their sound.
Yeah.
And they've got an enormous database, it seems, of how to do that with all the parts lists and all this kind of stuff. But they've also done this thing called a pedal Pi. And it uses, you mentioned Raspberry Pi Zero.
Yeah.
It uses a little Raspberry Pi Zero board. And you build your own little stomp box. It's got a big switch that you put your foot on. It's got 2 6¼ jacks for input and output. There's a handful of... It's probably a shopping basket full of components. None of it, I expect, is particularly expensive, in its own little plastic case. And the idea is that you can use all the code that people have generated for the Raspberry Pi to turn this pedal into whatever it is you want it to do. So they're saying here there's a database of ready-to-use software that'll do distortion, fuzz, delay, echo, octave, reverb, tremolo, or if you wanted to go really weird and do your own effects, you can sit there and type it out. It's got a little analog to digital converter on the board so that it'll actually do all the work in the Raspberry Pi. And I've got to say, for almost the first time, I'm really tempted to sit there and go, you know what?
Should they?
This is something I could try.
You should.
Because it's the sort of thing I might actually use.
If I can dig out another Raspberry Pi from a drawer somewhere, then it's on its way to you, Dave.
It just is this little Zero, and they've released the whole thing. They've got all the parts lists. They've got the code that you need to use to make it work. They lay the circuit out so it tells you how to put it together. I was really impressed when I found this, and it's this cute little thing. Just uses a clear Perspex top, so it's not the sort of thing that you could stomp on in the middle of a Led Zeppelin concert. It will probably break if you really tried, but at the same time, this is something you can make yourself, and it can do exactly what you want it to do. And I've got to say, those metal stomp boxes, I've got 3 or 4 of them. They're not cheap. They're cast iron with all the electronics inside them. They're not cheap things. If you could get something to do your own, why shouldn't you?
Yeah.
So that's my little project. That might even be my first introduction into the whole actual creating something with a Pi.
Sounds cool. You should do it, mate. I mean, that's the thing. The Pi Zero is the cheapest chips. The bits to go with it, it's just a bit of coding. There'll be loads of YouTube stuff, and you'll be able to find out how to do it easy. I mean, this is a great thing about the Pis. They're just so well supported by a community that you can, it doesn't matter how much experience you've got, you should be able to pick it up relatively easily.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favourite projects I've actually worked on for myself that I still use at least once a week was the sort of retro gaming that you can do through Raspberry Pi. And again, I did all of that. That was one of the first projects I did where I was just following step-by-step instructions online, and if I was getting stuck with anything, asking the community and getting responses. So I've managed to develop a whole sort of little mini arcade out in the garage now, and it's all based on Raspberry Pi.
Very cool.
Fantastic.
So it's time now for the final section of the show, as we each put forward our nominations for Geek of the Week, where we each nominate one person who deserves the title and then ultimately agree on the winner. So, Dave, you went last there. Would you like to go first this time?
Okay, I'm gonna. I don't know if this is a break with tradition. Bear in mind, this is our 13th podcast. I suppose we could say we've got traditions now. But my Geek of the Week is actually Pete.
Like it. He's not allowed to win, of course.
He's not. I suppose he's not allowed to win. But the fact is, I mean, I'm lucky. I've known Pete now for what it is, 16 years, something like that.
Yeah, probably about that.
We've worked together at a couple of different companies, and then even since I left RS, we've been friends and been chatting ever since. And it's rare that you'll find someone who is as enthusiastic about spreading the word about technology. It doesn't matter whether it's Raspberry Pi or whether it's Sequest, and frankly, it doesn't matter if the project is doomed to failure. Pete has the enthusiastic
There's been a
nature
few of them
that you've got. There's been a few things. I mean, we've been involved in a few things we talked about that never. It's probably best that they never actually see the light of day.
Yeah.
But the fact is, it's I can't think of anybody I personally know who is more enthusiastic about helping people understand and adopt and it's not even as if you're just saying, oh, you need to do this. It's just like you said to me just now, oh, you should do it, Dave, you should give it a go. That kind of approach is it goes a long way. You're engaging with people. Pete and I have been friends for a long time, so he's probably going to be blushing. He's going to tell me off at the end of the call. But the fact is,
I'm flattered,
this is
Dave.
your
Thank
kind
you.
of world, Pete. This is your kind of world, and it's I think it's been fun working with you all these years. Hope you carry on doing it.
Yeah, did so. Thanks, mate.
I'd echo that one, actually. I mean, it's definitely, I don't think I'd be anywhere near as passionate about even ever trying out anything with a Raspberry Pi if it wasn't for working with you, Pete, because you are such an advocate of everything. And the fact that, I mean, the story that you shared with everybody at the start here in how Raspberry Pi even came about within RS and how it all started, I mean, that's kind of legend within our business, and everybody knows Pete as the Raspberry Pi guy.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
So, Pete, who are you up against?
I'm stunned.
Over to you.
Well, it's got to be Eben Upton, isn't it, for me? I mean, Eben, I know he's not the only person in the Pi Foundation, but he's one of the original founders and probably has been the face of Raspberry Pi. I guess it's the beginning. But the fact that, I think it was initially his idea when he was working at Cambridge University as a professor, I think, or an intake officer, or if it was at the time. And, the fact that he had this vision, obviously, to help young engineers and get kids into coding, and obviously realised that we live in this digital world now, and the fact that the skills are lacking. He did see, I mean, one of the reasons behind it was that, he saw when we were kids, of our generation, this sort of 80s, if you like, and early 90s, we were doing bits of coding and we were building PCs and stuff. And then when the PlayStation comes along, it kind of killed everything, so kids stopped coding. They didn't buy PCs, they bought PlayStations and games consoles, and the kind of PC thing kind of went all a bit geeky again, whereas before we were all, doing Amstrads and Commodore 64s and Spectrums and all that kind of stuff.
BBC Micro,
and we all cut our teeth on those, especially you and I, Dave, of our generation. Eben was a sort of similar generation. I think BBC Micro was his first computer. And I think what he saw, the fact that kind of generation had kind of got lost, and the fact that, coming in with games consoles had killed all of that. So we had this lost generation of kids who didn't know how to code, right? So this is why, the Pi sort of was born, and then he got, a load of people to help him kind of develop the idea. So yeah, for me, just because of that, just the fact that he wanted to make sure that the kids of, today, and the fact that we're now in this digital economy, and the fact that, code is the new oil, as they say, data is the new oil, code is the new oil, it's so important that our kids get into, or at least learn about how to do some sort of coding, because let's face it, as in future roles, a lot of these jobs that don't exist today, they'll be code-based or data-based, or so for me, that's why I think Eben, because he's been a bit of a pioneer in trying to relight, I guess, kids, ensuring that the next generation, that we've got programmers and people developing, next Elon Musk, all those kind of things. So that's me, Eben.
Brilliant. And mine is somebody who Eben would have been trying to actually reach in creating it in the first place. So it's somebody called Matt Timmons Brown.
Yes.
People may know him better as the Raspberry Pi guy. So Matt started off very, very early when Raspberry Pi started, actually sharing tutorials, sharing some sort of easy ways of getting started with the Raspberry Pi, and then he started to blog about it on YouTube as well as on his website. And it was just incredible to see, because he, at the time, I mean, I don't know exactly how old he was, but he can't have been much older than maybe 15, 16. I think he was
younger than that, I think.
Maybe even younger, yeah. So,
yeah.
I mean, I remember one of the first things I seen from him was when he created a skateboard using the Raspberry Pi that was an automated skateboard going around, which was so cool.
Yeah.
And was one of the first viral videos I'd seen. But just ultimately, he was great at helping to get others involved. He obviously had a passion, and similar to the reasons you said for Pete as well, Dave, is that he clearly had a passion for Raspberry Pi. But he then helped to bring other people in his school, and then ultimately people beyond that and in the wider sort of society and other schools into realizing exactly what could be done with the Raspberry Pi. So he's unbelievable. He actually went on to win a Bright Sparks award a few years back, I think 2017. But I know that he actually went on the back of his work there of just sort of blogging about something he loved. He ended up with an internship at Raspberry Pi Foundation. He ended up with an internship at ARM. He's been out studying in China. He's been back working for, I think he worked for Amazon at one point. He worked for Huawei at one point, and now he's back at ARM again. So it's obviously stood him in good stead all the way through that. But yeah, that's my nomination, Raspberry Pi guy.
Very cool. It's obviously me, right? No. So I know Matt. I think Matt is an incredible character in the fact that when I first learnt how young he was and he was doing all these videos, and I think he was like 13 or 14 at the time, and I'm thinking, wow, what an inspiration. This is exactly what Eben was trying to do. And the fact that Matt, took and embraced that Raspberry Pi and got all his mates into it and started doing videos and inspiring people. For me, I guess that's really the spirit of what it's all about. So I think for me, I would vote for Matt. I think he's been brilliant at what he's done.
I think I would too. You got to say hats off to Eben for being one of the brains behind this. But the fact that Matt is he's just this shining example of exactly what Eben was hoping to do. He's inspired someone to embrace technology, to learn new things, and the fact that Matt has now got himself a career off the back of this, it's a combination of having the right tech at the right time, but then having the determination to do it. I think he's an inspiration.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So I will give my vote to Pete, because Pete, you do deserve a vote. So overall, that's Matt Timmins-Brown, this week's Geek of the Week. Well done. And that brings us to the end of yet another episode. So thanks once again for tuning in. If you enjoyed it, then please do 3 nice things for us. Subscribe on your favourite podcast platform, leave us a review, and share with a friend. For more episodes and bonus content, please head to designspark.com/podcasts, and we'll see you all again next time. Thanks, guys.
Cheers, guys.
See you soon.